Welcome back to my channel, guys. If you hear bizarre noises like clinking and clanking, they're doing construction outside. I can't figure out their work schedule. I would think construction is just Monday through Friday, but it seems like they're also doing clearly weekend construction at the building right next to mine. It's quite a pleasure to wake up to it at 8 a.m. every day. But anyway, this is just a quick rant video. I was thinking about this event that happened last weekend, and I wanted to briefly talk about it on this channel. Last weekend, I was at this work event, and it was one of those work events where it's so much schmoozing and small talk, which I loathe. And at the dinner, the final dinner of this event, I was like relieved that it was ending because I hate small talk, and I just wanted to go home. And they sat me next to this older woman who I had been consciously avoiding the whole work event because I could tell that she was a chatterbox. They seat me right next to her, and I'm like, oh shit, like she's gonna talk my ear off. And it's so funny how sometimes you have these assumptions, right, about people, and then you end up being pleasantly surprised. She told me that she was 21 when she moved to New York in 1980, so based on my math, she's about 65 years old, okay? So clearly much older than me. And she was telling me about her time in New York. We were talking about like, where are you from? Where have you lived? Blah, blah, blah. So, oh my God, they're really loud outside. Sorry if you can hear construction workers yelling at each other. So we were talking about our time in New York, and she was asking me about my time. And once I found out that she lived in New York through the 80s and 90s, I was so curious to hear about her stories. And it was like the classic New York City story of, she was a young 20-something-year-old girl in the 80s in New York. And she was like, New York City was amazing. Like every day was a new adventure and you did not know what to expect. And she talked about getting mugged in New York. And how obviously that would be traumatizing, but she was like, I wouldn't take any of it back because that was the best time in New York. And so now she lives in the suburbs in New York State, in upstate, and she was like, I had to leave because New York is not what it used to be. And you hear this often for people who know New York, that it was just a different city in the 80s and the 90s and even before that. For those of you who don't know, New York was like a dangerous city, a very dangerous city, and chaotic, and a lot more corruption and crime. And that was like the mafia era as well. And so she was telling me firsthand, like, yeah, New York is now a much more like watered down place and a homogenous place. And it was interesting to hear her. I never thought of it this way, but she basically explained it as, it's now so expensive as a city to live there that you can't live there unless you're wealthy. And even if you're not wealthy, somebody's wealthy who's taking care of you. Like your parents are taking care of you, or your man is taking care of you. And it's true. Like when I think back to my 20s in New York City, I was always financially struggling. And it's not that my friends around me were making a lot more money. In most cases, their parents were taking care of them, or they lived with their boyfriend, so they shared an apartment, a one bedroom or a studio with somebody that splits half the cost. Anyway, so hearing her talk about this, I was like, I never thought about it that way, that it, by definition, that changes the vibe of the city if most people there are of a certain level of privilege just from the base, like from the baseline. And so she was like, yeah, New York City is now like a lame city. It's not what it used to be. But she was telling me, and this is the point that I'm getting to with this video, she was telling me about how, being there in the 80s, she saw the rise of the crack epidemic and lived through that. And then the AIDS epidemic. And I was so curious to hear more about that. And she told me about how many friends she lost left and right. Because most of her friends were queer. And also even just the anxiety of her thinking like, I'm always around these people, I'm having sex with some of these men who are bi or questioning or whatever, and she thought she was convinced she would die of AIDS. And it's just interesting how this is a conversation that I otherwise would never get to have, right? I don't meet old women walking around town, but then you get into these bizarre circumstances where you start talking to somebody and you hear about their life. And the whole AIDS epidemic at its peak in the 80s and the 90s, we don't really hear about it much anymore. Would you agree with that? I feel like being a kid of the 90s, I remember that it was at the forefront of what I associated with being gay. And I thought, how will this, affect me when I become an adult? Like, it was something that was on my mind as a child. And yet now, of course, it's a different time with modern medicine. And that plays the biggest role in why the AIDS epidemic just doesn't have the same hysteria that it did then. But I find it bizarre that if you think about it, after having this conversation with this woman, I realized I don't remember the last time I talked to somebody about the AIDS epidemic. And that horrible time where it was thought to be the gay men's cancer. And cities like San Francisco and New York City were being like ravaged by this. Communities of people, especially gay men, were destroyed by this. It was really interesting to hear her take on it. And I'm kind of sappy as it is. So as she was talking, I was sort of projecting my own sort of fears and anxieties on her and just like imagining this like sad woman who, is probably now like a cat lady. Again, I'm projecting, but I just got the vibe that she's like this cat lady who lives in the suburbs and her best years are behind her and that she lives a life of solitude and that she lost so many people because she lived her heyday in New York City. She was with all these people that she's lost. That's at least how she described it. But what's interesting is she spoke about it fondly. And she said the 90s was the beginning of the end and the city just lost its flavor. So she spoke about it despite all that chaos and trauma. She spoke about it with such wistfulness. I just thought it was fascinating. Meanwhile, my time in New York, I feel like I was just a sad person. I wasn't dealing with stuff that heavy, but I don't look back at my years fondly. So it's interesting how we can combine. I guess it's sort of like an abusive relationship, right? It's like you can recognize that something was not good or that there was a lot of bad in it, and yet still sort of get nostalgic for it somehow, or be able to separate what was great from the bad. But yeah, as I was listening to her, I thought it's kind of peculiar that we don't really hear much about this anymore. And I wonder why that is. Is it just that people don't want to be reminded of such a dark time? Is it that people don't like to revisit difficult subjects? I mean, even COVID, right? COVID was at the time of this video, was 5 years ago. Actually, almost to the day at the time that I'm making this video, it's mid-March, almost to the day 5 years ago lockdown began. And COVID is this thing that we all live through, and yet there's references to it here and there, but I feel like we never talk about COVID. It's like it never happened. It's like this bizarre 1 to 2 year period that our lives all just kind of froze and were put on hold. It's so bizarre to me. Like, what is that about? Is it again that people just don't want to revisit uncomfortable subjects and uncomfortable periods of life or of history? And now we're in this bizarre era as it pertains to HIV and AIDS, where, because of modern medicine and PrEP, we have a whole new generation of gay men who couldn't care less about HIV and or just STDs in general. They have, I think, no idea of that part of human history because they weren't alive for it. They weren't alive for the hysteria of the 80s and the 90s. Okay, rant over. The video's long enough. I do this every time. I'm like, I think this will be a 2-minute video, and then here I am talking for like 10 minutes. But let me know in the comments what you think about all this, and catch you next time.